is the belief that African countries should own themselves their strategies. And that has been the rationale behind the creation of what we call now poverty reduction strategies.
Burkina Faso has just done what most African nations have been too afraid to even dream of. President Ibrahim Traoré has rejected a $3 billion IMF debt relief deal, and in doing so, he tore through one of the most powerful illusions of our time, that foreign aid equals freedom. The IMF called it forgiveness. Traoré called it theft wrapped in courtesy, because buried deep inside the fine print of that so-called relief package was a familiar colonial trick, clauses demanding 40% of Burkina Faso's future gold and oil revenues, plus discounted uranium, pledged as collateral for stability. In other words, a deal that looked generous on the surface but hollowed out sovereignty at its core. But Traoré didn't sign. He didn't negotiate. He rejected it, publicly, loudly, and unapologetically. His voice thundered across the continent. Africa's resources are not collateral for Western comfort. Markets panicked. Washington froze. But Africa cheered. Because this wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was about every African nation trapped in an endless cycle of borrowing, restructuring, and begging for permission to breathe. For the first time in decades, an African leader had looked the IMF straight in the eye and said no. Not out of defiance, but out of dignity. Western media called it reckless. African youth called it freedom. Because everyone understood what had just happened. The IMF's formula of control, the same formula that had kept Africa in a financial chokehold for over half a century, had just met its first immovable obstacle in Ouagadougou. Within days, hashtags like #AfricaIsNotCollateral and #HandsOffOurGold exploded across social media. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Bamako to Accra, young Africans felt something shift. They recognized the pattern because they'd lived it. Every debt relief deal came with deeper dependence. Every aid package came with strings tighter than the last. This time, the script was different. The West called it historic. Traoré called it history repeating itself. For decades, institutions like the IMF have promised progress in exchange for reforms. Privatize your industries, cut your subsidies, open your markets. What they never said was that those same reforms would destroy local production, collapse national industries, and keep Africa exporting raw materials while importing finished goods. The result? Africa stayed poor, dependent, and obedient, all while being told it was being helped. Traoré saw through it. He didn't just reject a deal. He rejected an entire mindset. He drew a clear line between assistance and exploitation, between relief and repossession. And that's why his decision hit like an earthquake. Because if Burkina Faso could say no, what's stopping the rest of Africa? To understand what Traoré really refused, you have to understand how these deals work. The IMF doesn't come with guns, it comes with pins and contracts. It doesn't say, give us your gold. It says, guarantee repayment through resource-backed revenues. Sounds technical, harmless even. But behind that bureaucratic language lies a system that legally mortgages a nation's future wealth to foreign creditors. The genius of this system is that it hides its chains in jargon. Few people ever read the 90-page agreements that bind entire generations. And so, African nations keep signing away their futures in the name of short-term stability. Traoré refused that grammar of control. He saw the hidden architecture of obedience, how the IMF, the World Bank, and their Western partners built a web of dependency so tight that even independence began to feel like a myth. He refused to keep feeding that machine. Because the only way to collapse it is not to protest, it's to stop participating. But rejecting the IMF is only half the story. The question now is, what replaces it? Traoré knew that saying no would bring retaliation. Western media would smear him. Credit rating agencies would label Burkina Faso unstable. Investors would flee. And still he refused. Why? Because he had already started building the alternative. His vision begins with resource sovereignty, the belief that Africa's wealth must stay in Africa. In the last 2 years, Burkina Faso has launched its first state-run gold refinery, capable of processing hundreds of kilograms per day. For the first time, gold extracted from Burkinabe soil is refined, stored, and circulated domestically before a single ounce leaves the country. Wealth is no longer extracted, it's retained, recirculated, and reinvested. The second pillar is regional self-reliance. Traoré knows that no single African nation can resist global pressure alone. That's why he helped form the Alliance of Sahel States, a union of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Together, they're building joint refineries, shared defense networks, and trade routes independent of France and the EU. They're planning oil refining projects, gold-backed trade settlements, and local currency exchanges. Their goal is to end the colonial map that divided their economies and replace it with an African system that connects them. The third pillar is strategic partnership beyond the West. Traoré isn't isolating Burkina Faso. He's diversifying it. Deals with Russia for energy, with China for infrastructure, and with Turkey for defense manufacturing are being built not on charity, but on exchange: gold for technology, uranium for infrastructure, training for logistics, trade not tribute. And the West hates that, because a self-sufficient Africa cannot be controlled. An Africa that no longer borrows, no longer obeys. But the empire doesn't retreat quietly. It retaliates. Almost immediately after Traoré's rejection, Western credit agencies whispered about rising instability. Newspapers branded him a militarized populist. European partners suspended development talks. And French media recycled the same old narrative. Burkina Faso is spiraling. It's the same playbook used against every African leader who dared to defy them, from Nkrumah to Sankara. When you refuse their loans, they attack your credibility. But Traoré anticipated this. He prepared a survival economy, rooted in local trade, agricultural cooperatives, and nationalized mining enterprises. He began sourcing imports from neighboring African nations and Asian partners instead of Europe. And while the West tried to isolate him, he turned that isolation into strength. Every Western insult became proof of his message, that Africa's fight was never about aid, but about autonomy. At home, his popularity exploded. Abroad, his defiance became inspiration. Still, defiance alone doesn't feed a nation. Traoré knows the real test is endurance, proving that sovereignty is not only moral but sustainable. And that's where his next move begins, designing a new African financial system that makes the IMF obsolete. Together with Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso is drafting what they call the Sahel Financial Charter, a blueprint for resource-backed trade, local currency payments, and regional credit systems independent of the dollar and euro. Imagine African nations trading oil for gold, or minerals for machinery, without ever touching a Western currency. That's not fantasy anymore. It's policy. This is the economic version of what they already achieved militarily: the removal of foreign bases and the restoration of territorial control. And Traoré isn't stopping there. His government is in active talks with BRICS institutions like the New Development Bank to fund infrastructure and agriculture, loans without the colonial strings. The philosophy is simple: borrow for production, not for obedience. Across the continent, his example is sparking new debates. Young economists are revisiting ideas once dismissed as impossible: gold-backed African currencies, continental digital banks, cooperative energy markets. What once sounded like rebellion now sounds like reason, because Traoré has done something more powerful than rejecting a loan. He has broken a psychological chain. The belief that Africa must ask for permission to prosper. And that may be his greatest legacy. Yes, the road ahead will be brutal. Retaliation will come through sanctions, propaganda, and sabotage. Some leaders will fold, some will sell out. But the seed has already been planted. The illusion of African dependence has cracked. And the world is watching what grows next. If the Sahel Alliance succeeds, if Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger can stabilize their economies, trade among themselves, and attract investment from the global south, it will mark the birth of a post-IMF Africa. An Africa that finances Africa. An Africa that no longer negotiates its freedom. And when that day comes, Ibrahim Traoré's defiance won't be remembered as rebellion. It will be remembered as the moment Africa finally stood up and said,